morning. Thank you very much for coming along to this session. It's going to be about the subnational transport bodies. Again, I've been coming here for 5 years. I've seen them sort of grow and expand, and now there are 7 of them, I think, at the moment. We've got 4 of them here. They played a big, pivotal role in the major roads network. Another thing, really, that I saw born at one of these conferences. That's a £3.5 billion pot. But they're actually having a much wider influence than that in terms of setting strategy and lobbying government and thinking beyond transport and how it fits in with urban planning and keeping the carbon footprint down and all of those things. So we're going to hear a lot about that today. So I'll introduce who we've got here. So we've got Rupert Clubb is the lead officer for Transport for the South East. Rupert's going to be talking about the role of STBs in climate change. Peter Molyneux has stepped in for Barry White from Transport for the North, who obviously are the only guys here with that statutory power at the moment, so everyone's jealous of you. Maria Machancoses, which hopefully I've got the pronunciation right, from Midlands Connect, who's going to be talking about the link with the industrial strategy. Martin Tugwell from England's Economic Heartland. And then we've got Steve Gooding again, who you'll recognise from the first session, and this is where he was meant to be all along, who's going to be giving us that sort of interesting independent voice on all of this. So we're going to get everyone to talk about a subject area specifically. We'll have a bit of a chat about that, and then we'll move on to the next person, and then at the end we'll talk about the wider role of STBs. On Slido, we did have it up there. Basically, if you download the Slido app, Slido, and then it asks for a hashtag, and the hashtag is HWYSUK. So HWYSUK, it's the same as the Twitter tag. Then you can post a question. You don't have to put your name on it. They're going to come up here on our monitors, and I'll get it on my phone as well, which I will remember to get out now. And so we will try and ask some of your questions as well. We had some really good questions in that first session. So it's your chance to put it over there without the embarrassment of someone stumbling over to you with a microphone and having to stand up and ask the question. Although we might do a bit of that as well a bit later on. But let's kick off first of all with Rupert from Transport for the South, who's going to be talking about your role with climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I mean, I think we're in a really quite an interesting sort of phase. I think it was just yesterday that the BBC was saying 11,000 scientists have come together and said that climate change and dealing with and mitigating climate change is going to be one of the most increasing challenges. And it's quite interesting when you start to look at transport and transport emissions as an overall proportion of UK greenhouse gases. It's this massive elephant in the room. Industrial processes and energy production are cleaning up their acts, and yet transport as that overall proportion is still a massive component. So I think STBs have a really important role in dealing with that. That is not to say that roads aren't important strategic transport corridors. They are, and they will continue to be so. But we need to think more about that sort of whole mobility. And it's interesting, as we launched our transport strategy about 3 or so weeks ago, we had some speakers from youth cabinets and youth groups, and they were very, very clear that the environment and climate issues are at the top of their agenda, and their expectation is that us, and that's not just us here, it's you here as well, are going to sort it out as the decision makers, as the leaders in the transport world, that you are going to help provide a better place. So I think that sets out some real challenges. So for us as an STB, we're thinking about issues such as pay-as-you-go mobility. So at the moment, you'll pay for an Uber, you'll pay to get a bus, you'll pay to get the tube. We don't pay directly for the miles that we drive on the road network. So extending pay-as-you-go mobility might be a way of managing demand, bringing about a modal shift, at the same time working with technology companies, industry, to develop new and emerging technologies for vehicles that will use those important road corridors. So I think, for STBs, if you think about what we're about how we can facilitate economic growth, how we can facilitate well-being. And I think, the element of our transport strategy has that emphasis on sustainability. you have to put the environment at the heart of your decisions around economic growth, around the sort of social infrastructure. It has to be a key component. And so for STBs, we're embarking on that journey, understanding the things that we need to do to play our part in relation to a climate emergency. And that transport is one of those key elements that will need addressing. So that's my sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the climate challenges.
Where are you getting your sort of evidence from? So you're having to project ahead and say, well, look, we should be looking at this and we should be looking at that. How are you making those decisions? Who are you talking to? How are you deciding where you think things should be going?
So in terms of evidence base, it's not for STBs to compile evidence to say that you need to address the issues that a changing climate brings. There are 99% of the world's scientists are saying, right, you lot, you've got to sort something out. Our job is to try and look to what the future might bring. So our transport strategy takes us out to 2050. A lot can happen in 30 years. Technologies change, and you'd have heard it hundreds of times around the Betamax VHS debate. Which technology do you plump for? We know that connected or driverless vehicles are going to probably develop at pace. We can see the electric vehicle market starting to pick up. And that's why road corridors are going to be of increasing importance, because it all may well be the case that we're not driving around in internal combustion engines. You'll be driving around in electric vehicles. But those pinch points, those congestion points will still be there. So trying to think about what future technology, where that might lead us. We're doing a lot of work with, I suppose, what you'd call innovators or disruptors in this world, to try and help with our understanding of how we then plan to implement transport interventions in the future. And part of that is going to be the development of mobility as a service. So if you talk to younger people, they don't want to own a car. Why would you want to pay 20 grand for a car that 95% of the time sits on your driveway, rusting away? If you're 17, try and get insurance. Those of you that have got kids that are just about to drive, it's crippling. You almost have to remortgage, don't you, to pay the costs of the insurance. And younger people are saying, all I'm interested in is getting from A to B. I don't really mind how I do it, but I want to do it in a clean way, in a sustainable way. I want it to be reliable, cost-effective, and so on and so forth. So a large component of our strategy will have or has emphasis on that mobility as a service, and understanding how that might shape up over the next 30 years.
Okay, we're starting to get some questions in, which I'll come to in a second, and one of them was about how you're putting the environment at the forefront of what you're doing, which I think you've just answered, so thank you for that. We actually get some of the questions on the monitor as well, so these guys can see it. There might be one or two they want to tackle. But let's go to you, Peter, next. I'm assuming you're all going to say fairly similar things about, bringing in the environment, but isn't it kind of an impossible balancing act? Because you've got these cities that are expanding, everyone's moving, everyone wants to move around. People are not kind of, cycling around as much as people would like. People are not getting buses like people would like. Isn't it kind of an impossible task to increase the amount of transport but cut the amount of carbon?
I think it's a difficult challenge. I think, transport bodies are about economic growth. We started off with an independent economic review. What it said was that the North was 25% less productive than the rest of the country simply because of poor connectivity. So just because there's an environmental challenge, that shouldn't mean that those places stay poorly connected for the rest of their lives. So what we've said is that from the work that we've done, poor connectivity leads to less productive areas. And the biggest problem that we all face is east-west, because investment has always been that north-south, let's get stuff to and from London. Now, the work that we've done and the prize and the why we were set up was that actually, if we're better connected, our research has shown that we could create nearly 850,000 jobs that wouldn't have otherwise been created, and £100 billion worth of extra economic activity. So we're starting to rebalance the UK economy. But the other thing is that we have to humanise the story. So what we're saying is that actually what we're saying to people is that we will give you access to a greater number of jobs. Not only that, we'll say to businesses who want to invest in the north or in any of the areas that we want, we'll give you access to a bigger pool of talent. So if you live in Liverpool and you want to get a job in Leeds, at the moment, that's an hour and a half to 2 hours commute. Where with Northern Powerhouse Rail, it'll be an hour's commute. So we can start to move people, goods and services around in a better way. So it's about our multimodal approach, which is the way we're taking it. And what we're saying is that transport is an enabler to economic growth and to well-being. And the recent research that's come out, particularly from about looking at inequality. So if you have poor transport and you can't afford it, that restricts your ability to access jobs, health, leisure activities, education. So actually there are far more social value in transport that we are not currently using as part of our argument. And actually that is how we can humanise it and also give politicians the tools to make the right decisions.
Okay, I'm going to use one of the questions now from here for you, Maria, and we'll pass it down the line a bit as well. The last 25 years has seen a number of different rationales used to introduce and justify road user charging, which haven't worked. Will tackling air quality and battling climate change be the rationale that succeeds? I mean, you know, is road user charging realistic? We've talked about it every year for the last 5 years. No political party will go anywhere near it. Could this be the thing that tips it, do you think?
The debate goes on. I mean, Birmingham City at the moment is having that debate as we speak, and it is directly linked to air quality. I think the whole debate around climate change, in terms of the evidence and what's happening, it's extremely important, and people want to know what's happening now. They want to have reassurance that we're planning for the future, but most importantly, how we're going to deal with matters now. So I will highly recommend to look at Birmingham at the moment as an example of they acknowledge that air quality is a massive issue for Birmingham City. And they're looking into, all of these measures, including road charging as well. Now, one thing that we cannot ignore is when it comes to equality, you cannot just put a boundary around an equality zone. So the one point that I was going to make is some national transport bodies can start looking at equality zones across the field and actually think about how the measures that are being set up to mitigate and to improve air quality in the areas do not just look at it in isolation. They understand the wider correlation to the surrounding areas, surrounding nearby cities and towns, and therefore what transport can do to mitigate that and have a greater impact. So air quality is extremely important. Most of our cities are suffering from air quality. All areas around any railway station suffers from air quality, for instance. So we need to talk about decarbonizing the railways, diesel trains, we need to finish that. So there's a lot of ideas and concepts, but how we escalate it and roll it out across the country. So it's not just pockets that are becoming innovative and are making a difference, but you've got that impact at a wider scale is where some national transport bodies come into play. We've got to do this much more strategically, but with clear, tangible examples and initiatives that you can then roll out at a more strategic, scalable case. And that's certainly what we're doing in Midlands Connect.
Martin, I covered the VW scandal a lot when the Dieselgate, basically, and then so the reaction to it was, well, perhaps we'll start banning diesels in small towns and cities. And when I talked to a lot of councils, there was a lot of panic there about whether they were going to have to start, penalising drivers for driving in, and the government was kind of forcing them to come up with a decision and a plan and putting the ball in their court. And there was a lot, no one really knew what to do. How do you see the STB roles in terms of like being a bridge between the government telling councils what to do and the councils thinking the government should be making those choices, and what's your role in it?
So I think this is where the STBs are uniquely placed to be providing strategic leadership. We're able to not only look across the transport modes, but as I know many of my colleagues in the other 6 STBs, we're looking at how what happens in transport relates to choices in other aspects of policy. Because it's a going back to sort of rule one of transport planning. Travel is a derived demand. We want to get access to services and opportunities. People want to have the chance to better themselves. They want to have access to the services that make their quality of life. So we need to think about what is it that people are looking for, how can we help them realize their potential and their ambitions. And I think that's where the subnational transport bodies are very well placed to think about how we use the regional evidence bases that we've all had to produce to support, first of all, the work on the major road network, but they're much more powerful beyond that. Within England's economic heartland, we have a database which pulls together the known knowns, but we also have a policy scenario tool that allows us to explore some of these choices that we as individuals face, using material from databases like Experian database, which actually give us an insight as to the choices we make as individuals. And I think that's, for me, how we can bring an aggregate view on the strategic choices to then set the framework and, frankly, start to set a vision for the future. A lot of our work to date has been around evidence-led, evidence-based, thinking about what we know and then projecting that forward. I think what you're seeing in the STBs is we're grasping that opportunity to be visionary, to think about what kind of place do we want? What do we need to do for businesses to be prosperous? What do we need to help support individuals, their communities, realize their potential? The power of vision and strategic planning has perhaps been underestimated or perhaps forgotten in the last 10 years. And I think what you're seeing in subnational transport bodies is that vision and that strategic leadership being reinvented. And personally, you know, I kind of, this year, 50 years since the man landed on the moon. It started with a man having a vision, and 8 years later, having created an industry, having created a momentum, you saw one of the biggest triumphs of humanity. And I think we're facing the scale of the challenge we know. We need our own moonshot moment. If we're looking at 2050, that's 3 Apollo programs. If we can't achieve transition in that, then we need to be thinking about how we do things better.
There's a good question coming in here, which I'm going to bring in a second. But Steve, you're here to give a kind of an independent overview, umbrella view on it. How do you see the decision-making process to getting things done, like balancing transport against climate and different departments talking to each other and all the collaboration you need to make these joint decisions? How do you think the system is set up at the moment and working?
I think that possibly the most important thing to recognise is that this is very, very hard. And we were talking earlier on about getting a properly integrated transport policy, which was something that John Prescott wanted to do. And it's much easier to say that you want it than it is to take into account bus, rail, light rail, cars, trucks, vans, even for one town, let alone for a country. So let's recognise that it's hard. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. I think we've seen some welcome signs of a bit better join-up at the national level between government departments who have, frankly, been quite siloed in the past. I think that I certainly welcome the fact it's 9 years since the 2010 coalition government told us that regions weren't a thing. I think it was the peak of localism, of let's think about the local community and draw a little line around your house and it's the nearest 100 people. That's all very well for some things, but I think those of us who've been involved in transport and transport planning and transport forecasting for a long time were very taken by what we used to call the travel to work area. And I think that the value for me currently of the subnational transport bodies is to be able to take a joined up, cross-modal look at travel to work areas, just as we were hearing about the north earlier on, about people who might live in one place and want to travel to another. What could be done to open up those employment opportunities more? My ambition, I would say, is that not only will the other subnational bodies receive the statutory recognition that Peter has in Transport for the North, but that over time they will become subnational transport and planning bodies And then we really will start to see an end to the days when transport is thought about after you've decided where to put the housing, where to put the distribution centre, and where to put the employment centre, when actually transport constraints and transport opportunities should be right at the front of that process.
Okay. We're going to come to a couple of questions now. I think we'll deal with that legal status thing a bit later as well, because I think that's a really interesting point. So this one says, how do you balance economics, for all of you, I guess, really, how do you balance economic and climate change challenges across STB regions? Climate change challenges don't stop at the boundary. So how much do you all talk together? How much do you coordinate what you're doing? You know, it's a fair point, isn't it? The NO2 or the NOx doesn't just stop, you know, when you get to a certain area.
I mean, my response to that is, well, you've got 4 of us here. We've got colleagues from the other 3 STBs in England in the room and at the event over the next couple of days. We meet. You get 7 groups of people together. You have got the strategic transport bodies for England in one room. And we talk about the issues of common interest. We work across boundaries on a bilateral, trilateral basis. It's very easy to get those strategic bodies together and work together. And I think there's an offer there to the government that you work with us as a group, you work with the political leaders from those 7 bodies, and you can have a really powerful conversation about the genuinely strategic issues.
I think what's interesting as well is that a recent example, you know, the government wrote to every single local highway authority about the rollout of electric vehicles. Why didn't they just write to the 7 of us and ask us to pull it together like we did for the major road network investments and when we gave our priorities to the strategic road network as part of that? You know, we've got an intelligence and evidence base where we could be useful, so they're not having conversations with 158 highway authorities, but having conversations with 7 people. I think the other thing is about how we provide longevity. So in the past, one of the problems that we've had is stop-start, boom-bust. So we haven't got a good public transport system to move people onto. So what we're saying is the 7 of us will have in the near future a 30-year investment plan that is signed up by their political leaders and their LEPs. And so therefore, actually, what we then need is certainty over funding and delivery powers. And what we can do is once we've got that in plan, we've then got a transport plan for the UK, because we will have done that. Or should I say for England. We also work with Wales and Scotland to make sure that our plans are joined up there. But I think once we've got that certainty. But also, as I said at the start, transport is an enabler. So the funding for solutions needs to come outside of the transport box, because we're going to provide the solutions for housing, we're going to provide the solutions for jobs, because people are going to have to travel to do them. So I think government needs to look at how it provides funding to give solutions to regions or subnational transport body areas, rather than I'm a minister and I've got my little portfolio of funding and I'm only going to spend it on that. Because the solutions are far more complex than that, as Steve said, so therefore we need a far more sensible approach to going forward.
Just coming back to climate side, there's one question here which is quite technical, and it's got your name on it, Rupert, so I'm going to give it to you. Cold recycled asphalt saves 40% CO2. It's been a highway standard for over a decade, but little used. It's basically saying, have you guys looked at that as one possible solution?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a material scientist, so I mean, I am aware of this, and you know, it comes down to how that performs over a period of time. So, you know, I couldn't comment on whether I may well be a budget holder, but I want to know that the stuff that I'm putting down is actually going to be there a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years later. And I suppose as highway authorities, you know, many of us have, dare I say, fallen into the trap of using a new material, and it's failed in a relatively short period of time. So, you know, providing it's got all the technical specifications and performance specifications that surround it, I don't see why not. I think it is a challenge, actually. You know, we automatically think about emissions from vehicles, but, you know, the materials that we're using in construction are equally important. And, you know, one of the challenges for us is thinking about that whole life emissions. You know, in the same way that we look at whole life costing, we need to be looking at whole life emissions. So that has to include our supply chains and, you know, materials associated with that. So, you know, clearly I'm not going to give a commitment to use a material here, but, you know, those are the types of innovations that we need to see coming forward.
Can I just build on that? Because I have the privilege this year of being the president of the CIHT, and we had one of our get-togethers with our corporate partners earlier this month. And what was really astounding was, building on Rupert's point, there's an understanding and an appetite within the client side and in the delivery side to reset the questions that we're needing to answer when we make the investment. So rather than just thinking about the short-term here and now cost, what is the longer-term cost of delivering? What is the longer term of achieving our outcomes? Are we actually clear what are the key outcomes we're trying to deliver, whether it's in terms of health, well-being, environmental impact? And I think, for me, there's a need and an opportunity, particularly as we're focusing on a spending review coming next year, to help reset the question, to help decision makers in Westminster reset those questions to make some of these choices more aligned with the longer term objective.
Can I say, one of the reasons why I love coming to these forums is that I get direct exposure to the industry and they're real experts on infrastructure delivery and maintenance. So I think that question is extremely right for the industry to come to STBs. You know, if we're thinking about how we can make a difference strategically, STBs need to totally engage with industry in terms of what's working at the moment and having a clear impact in the environment. So we can then, as mentioned earlier, roll out, make awareness, and raise the profile of the real things from an industry perspective that makes the difference. And it is, hopefully together, it's about standards and ensuring that everybody gets access to the same innovation across the piece, across the country. So I think we've got a real role to play here when it comes to climate change and sustainability and innovation in particular, to listen to you more. So that's what my message to you is. We need to figure out at STBs how we can listen more to the innovation in the industry so it becomes more real, more tangible, not just the strategic visionary work. We need to be seen as leaders in the way that transport gets delivered and planned and maintained in the future. And therefore, thank you for that question. I will say, share with us your innovation and we'll do our best to celebrate and raise awareness of these kind of things with Highways England and the department.
You know what they look like now, so you can come find them. So I'm very naughty. I've moved away a bit from our pitches, but Peter, you were going to talk a little bit about transport and its role in the economy. I know you've mentioned quite a lot of it at the moment as well, but what were you going to say about that, your role in growing the economy?
Yeah, so the point is that it goes back to the first point, is that we know that at the moment, whatever happens after the election, there will be a change in the way we do business with the rest of the world. And so one of our things that we found from our independent international connectivity study is that the biggest problem that the ports and the airports have is the surface transport to those ports and airports to get goods in. We also know for a fact that 60% of the goods coming into the southern ports then travel by road up to the north. So I think the question is that by coming together, we can say improving the access to ports and airports, we can move our freight round a lot better. I think as well is that in terms of the economy is giving the compelling argument to business to change the way they do business. So for example, we know that the difference between school holiday traffic and non-school holiday traffic on our roads in the peak is about 10 to 15%. So how many businesses could change their employment to move away from presenteeism to more output? So actually people don't have to travel in the peak or don't have to travel to work 5 days a week. So some of it is about how do we make better use of the existing network, as well as also providing access to new employment sites and housing sites. And I think what we can do is we can be the conduit for those conversations. And I think picking up the spatial planning that Martin was referring to and Steve was referring to earlier on, is that previously spatial planning's being done, and then, by the way, how do we then get people and goods to that? If each of us set out a 30-year transport plan, then we can review that spatial planning to make sure that there are more sustainable ways of moving people, goods and services around in those areas. And that long-term investment will mean that you will get some private sector investments as well, and not just public sector.
Rupert?